on the Iran war. I want to welcome Atlantic staff writers Tom Nichols, Olorunnipa, sorry, Tolu, and Nancy Youssef. Since Saturday's attacks on Iran, I can assure you that Tom, Tolu, Nancy, and I and our colleagues here at The Atlantic have been working literally nonstop between the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the Trump administration's response, the complicated history of regime changes, and what comes next. And so thank you all for being with us. We asked our readers to submit questions, audience questions in advance. And so we're going to take those questions in just a little bit to be part of the conversation. But first, I want to jump right in. Tom, I'm going to start with you. Just summarize for us how we got to this moment where the US decided, along with Israel, to launch this massive military operation in Iran.
I think this moment actually begins a lot earlier than the weeks before the attack. I think that the Israelis in particular have decided that the Iranian regime had to go. It wasn't something they could do on their own. I think they've convinced the Trump administration that that the Iranians are in a uniquely weak position now, and that if you kind of kick the door in, the whole thing will come tumbling down. And so I think that this moment really has its genesis in months and months ago. And clearly from the reporting that you and our colleagues have been doing, the Israelis and the Americans pretty much decided on all of this weeks ago. And then we're just waiting for the opportune moment, particularly when they could decapitate the leadership, to just go ahead and engage in this preventive war.
I mean, but the administration has thrown out, Tom, a few objectives and a few issues that obviously kind of culminated this moment, talking about their nuclear program and failed efforts to negotiate, their missile program, their naval capabilities and harassing ships that were passing through the region, even the proxies across the region that were helping Iran to kind of conduct its destabilizing activities. And so how much of that has factored in truly versus, what the administration is kind of telling us?
Well, I think that I think for all those reasons, and, look, there has always been a case for trying to knock out the Iranian regime. I mean, it's a terrible regime. They are the source of a lot of trouble and pain and misery in the world. Excuse me. But I think that they've been kind of dialing through rationales when really the fundamental rationale for all this is that the Israelis and the Americans have decided this is an intolerable regime and it has to go. This is kind of like what we went through with Iraq, where we said, well, there's a lot of reasons to depose Saddam. But in the end, the Bush administration, I think, had decided that just for all these reasons, Saddam had to go. And it's interesting now that the Trump administration seems to be backpedaling a little bit and saying, well, we only have these 4 objectives about nukes and missiles and the Iranian Navy and terrorism, even though from the get-go, the first thing Donald Trump ever said about this war has all been framed in terms of regime change.
Nancy, I'm going to get to the question of imminent threat in a moment, because this is a phrase that we've heard repeatedly from the administration in recent days. However, before that, just give us a little background on the U.S.-Israel relationship with regard to this, sort of who went in first, who wanted to launch this war, why was it a joint operation?
So as Tom noted, this was not an operation that Israel could carry out on its own, and literally for decades has been urging the United States to do more to combat threats from Iran. From what we can tell, based on the public statements that we've heard, that the Israelis brought a lot of intelligence when it came to targeting leaders and knowing where those leaders were and bringing those kinds of assets, including air capabilities. And the United States brought 2 things. One, the ability to defend Israel from retaliatory attacks by the Iranians by putting in place things like the destroyers and the USS Gerald Ford near its shores. And in addition, we brought the American firepower, more than 150 aircraft, Tomahawk missiles that could go in and launch strikes. And so it was interesting on Monday, Secretary of Defense Hegseth said that the U.S. focus was on the Navy and Iran's ballistic capability, suggesting that perhaps Israel's focus was on things like leadership. And so I think he was unintentionally sort of hinting at how the responsibilities were being divvied up in this. But in terms of the amount of firepower, I think it's led by the U.S., but the determination to launch this attack, I think, was led by Israel.
And so going to this question of imminent threat, we've heard from various administration officials that we had to go in there. We had to do what we did when we did it because there was an imminent threat. There was an imminent threat to military personnel in the region. There was an imminent threat to Americans across the region. But they haven't offered any intel or evidence for that. And so what do we know as far as what the imminent threat was and how imminent it really was?
So as you rightly point out, we've heard various explanations of an imminent threat. I thought the most telling was Marco Rubio's comments earlier this week on the Hill, in which he said he defined the imminent threat that Israel was going to launch a strike. And in response, Iran would strike retaliatory strikes. And that constituted a preeminent threat. I was telling someone the other day, it's sort of like, drinking all the alcohol out of your liquor cabinet in case your kid, your kid's going to go in it sometime. It's an approach. On the nuclear capability, we heard from Stephen Witkoff, one of the negotiators, that Iran was days, if not weeks away from a nuclear weapon, but didn't seem to provide evidence for that. And the problem with that explanation is if you really believe that, then it makes it all the more important to have the capabilities to stabilize those programs as you launch the strikes, which didn't happen either. There has never been any evidence that Iran was on the cusp of, in a matter of days or weeks, of launching some sort of nuclear strike, and we certainly haven't seen evidence of that. And I think
we had U.S. intel assessments that actually contradicted that last year.
That's right. So you'll remember last year, the United States conducted strikes on 3 nuclear facilities, and the president famously said that the program had been obliterated, only to say now that we have to tackle that program. They'll argue that it's been rebuilt. It's hard to imagine that something that was so destroyed could be rebuilt in a matter of months.
Right. So Toluse Olorunnipa, I'm trying to redeem myself. Sorry, Tolu. This is the president that campaigned largely on ending America's wars. You have written in the last couple of days extensively on the politics behind this, particularly within the base. Lay it out for us. I mean, why did the president that campaigned on promising to end America's wars launch not just one, but 2 massive military operations in recent weeks?
Well, the absence of a clear answer to that is part of the reason there's so much division within the president's base. He hasn't explained why he's doing this. Now, there are multiple different explanations that we've seen, that we've gone through in terms of the military objectives and the threat that was potentially posed by Iran to the American people, but it has not been a clear answer. And the people who support the president, who supported him in part because they did not like what past Republican presidents had done in terms of getting into wars, getting into the war in the Middle East with Iraq and Afghanistan, and all of the reverberations that have come because of those wars that lasted a very long time and cost a lot of damage in terms of American lives and treasure. President Trump campaigned over the course of the last decade saying that he was opposed to those wars, that he would not get America involved in those wars, that he would not be someone that would look to change regimes in the Middle East, or would not try to change the way people live in a faraway land that does not necessarily have a lot of bearing on what's happening in the U.S., that he would use those dollars, he would use that focus and have it be part of his America First policy, where it's all domestic focused. Now, the president seems to be much more focused on his broad legacy. He realizes that he can do a lot on the foreign stage without having to involve Congress, without having to worry about people checking him or questioning him. And so we do see him acting more on the foreign stage. And we do see him taking steps that, in his mind, in the mind of his advisors, are steps that previous presidents were not willing to take, steps that he will ultimately be hailed for in the annals of history. He believes that this is what will be part of his broad legacy as he looks at this second term. Now, that does not erase the politics of this. There still is a lot of concern among the president's base. They are still waiting for him to describe and explain exactly what he's doing. And they're giving him a leash to say that, this operation could go on for a short period of time. But if it does go on for a long time, we will hear more publicly from even more members of the president's base about how they're not opposed to this, how this is not what they voted for, and how this is a betrayal of what they thought they were getting when they voted for President Trump. And so,
Tolu, Republicans, sorry to interrupt you, but Republicans have been pretty concerned about the state of play in this midterm election year, even before we launched this military operation in Iran, where concerns that the president was focusing his attention too much overseas and not on some of those the massive problems facing Americans here at home. And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what White House advisors and others have been telling him, and as far as where his focus should be and how it's playing out in terms of where he's actually placing his focus.
Yeah, I talked about some of the divisions within the broad Republican Party and among the president's voters. That division is also in place in the White House among the president's close advisors. Not everyone was on board with this idea of this foreign adventurism and trying to do something in Iran that previous presidents had shied away from doing. And so there is a diversity of opinion and diversity of advice that the president's getting from his top advisors. Many are telling him that he does need to be laser focused on what the American people say they want ahead of these midterms, which is a president that's focused on their cost of living, focused on bringing down the inflation that many people have been dealing with over the last several years, that are focused on issues that are pocketbook issues for a domestic audience, and focused on the bread and butter issues that he said he was going to tackle when he became president. And so the fact that he is going and doing so much on foreign in terms of his foreign policy and spending so much of his political capital on foreign lands and on foreign adventures, that is something that is causing a number of his advisors to worry about the midterms, worry about where it leaves him politically, and worry about whether or not he's following their advice, that he should be laser focused on affordability, the cost of living, bringing down inflation, and telling Americans that he is focused on their pocketbook issues, not on all of these things that are happening across the global stage.
And Tom, some of those concerns have been echoed on the Hill as well. You've written your recent piece about Trump has given America a constitutional dilemma. You know, we talk about Congress raising concerns about him sidestepping War Powers Act and the Constitution more generally, including among some within his party. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, this has never happened. Presidents have, even when they have decided that they have the right to go to war or the right to use military force, they at least nod to Congress. They talk to them. They seek authorization of some kind. Presidents traditionally had, for going back to the 80s, are uncomfortable with the War Powers Act, and as I wrote, for good reason. I mean, the War Powers Act is a pretty poorly written piece of legislation, but they at least nod to it, and they report. A lot of times they use the language consistent with the War Powers Act. To at least nod to say, yes, Congress, you are the Article I power, you fund this, these are your sons and daughters, I should talk to you. Trump has decided that Congress, he's basically embarking on foreign policy and on a major war as if Congress doesn't even exist. And, that even the most subservient members of Congress can occasionally bristle at that. It's one thing to say, I want your support and I expect your support. It's another thing to say, you functionally don't exist in the universe of the United States government. And so you're getting some of the people on the Hill saying maybe we should invoke the War Powers Act. We need to have hearings. I don't think the Republicans are going to let the War Powers Act be invoked. And I think they're going to hamstring a lot of this. But even they, I think, at least some of them, really feel like they've been run roughshod over.
Vivian, could I jump in on this?
Jump in, please.
I think I want to tie the important points that Tolu and Tom have brought up in terms of the politics of this. And they're not siloed from the actual conduct of the war, that when you don't have political buy-in, when you have an American public that is impatient or unclear about what the U.S. is trying to achieve, that in and of itself can affect the battlefield. The Iranians could see a divided America over this and see that they might have more leverage in terms of putting psychological strains on the United States. It's one of the reasons you're seeing them go, for example, after Gulf states. They are trying to sort of break the psychological will of both the U.S. and its allies. If the president doesn't have buy-in, it can have tangible effects on the battlefield, because it's not just the Congress that we have to worry about, but and the politics, but how that politics shapes the decision making on the battlefield. And there's already examples of it, of an Iran that's making some calculation that they sort of, if they can just hold out while the American public sort of is divided over this, that they might be able to sort of survive what is an existential threat to their existence.
And you're seeing, if I can just add one
Tom.
thing to that, you're seeing the Americans respond to that by trying to thread this needle. On the one hand, they want to. You see Trump and Hegseth trying to push this as this great war of liberation and a heroic effort and an epical, world historical event. But then back up to no, don't call it a war. You have Republicans saying we don't want to call it a war because then that runs into all the kind of domestic problems that Tolu and Nancy just mentioned. So, what is the strategy here? Are we going guns blazing to take down the Iranian regime? Or is this just a kind of bigger police action to make sure the region is safe from nuclear weapons? And they're trying to have it both ways. And I don't think that's working.
And there's also a troubling blind spot, Nancy. One of the issues is that journalists can't access this conflict. It's actually the second time in a few years that journalists have not been able to access a major conflict in the Middle East. Obviously, Gaza also was one place that journalists couldn't go. But in this case, U.S. troops are being deployed, tragically getting killed in action. I mean, you and I covered the Middle East at length. We have embedded with U.S. and foreign troops at times of war, and right now that is not taking place. So talk to us about some of the complications of being able to really tell us what's happening, and especially since Iranians themselves are cut off from being able to get information to a large extent outside their country.
I'm so glad you raised this point because we have such little visibility on what's happening. We can't send journalists into Iran. There's an internet cutout. We can't reach Iranians. And in past wars, we were able to send journalists onto ships, into bases, in Humvees, crossing the wire with the troops. It's not only that that's not an option this time. Most of the press corps is not allowed in the Pentagon itself where these very decisions are being made. And so on a war where the implications are so big, and people are having such a hard time understanding it, I do think that lack of information not only makes it harder for us to do our job, but I think it makes it harder for the American public to understand what's happening. It's the first U.S. military conflict of this sort of scope and scale that I've covered, that I can only do it largely from my office rather than alongside those troops. It's different to feel that fear of drones or missiles coming into a base. It's different when you're in the Humvee with them and feeling the fears the same way that they are. It's different when you're talking to sailors on ships whose missions have been extended and hearing the strain on their families. It's all these little details that are the difference between really being able to understand and communicate the war to the American public and it remaining something sort of distant. And as you've seen in the last 4 days, confusing to those trying to understand what's happening.
And one of the other issues and complications, if you will, Tolu, is, the president and many administration officials have repeatedly said that they're doing this in large part to protect the homeland, to keep Americans safe. Interestingly, the Department of Homeland Security is partially shut down and has been for several weeks now. Can you talk a little bit about how that's also been clouding or complicating this narrative?
Certainly. I mean, there are a number of potential threats that are being monitored as a result of the situation in Iran. We've already seen one mass shooting in Texas that authorities believe could be related to the decision by the president to launch a war in Iran. And the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is partially shut down, largely over immigration issues, means that we are not at our full capacity to protect the homeland from potential attacks or potential actions by lone wolves or anyone who might want to take up a cause for any particular reason. It's also important to note that the president has often, talked negatively about wars overseas by saying, we have a big ocean in between the United States and these various foreign lands, whether it be Ukraine or Israel or China or anywhere else. And he's talked about how we're safe in large part, for lack of a better term, from the actions that might be taking place in foreign lands. But the very same president is the one that decided to launch this war thousands and thousands of miles away at a time when his Department of Homeland Security is partially shut down. And so there is a question of what this means for Americans who are confused about what's happening abroad, but it only really takes one mass shooting or one action back here at home to make this very real for the American public. And so war is a very confusing thing where it's unpredictable and there's no way to tell exactly how things could play out. And so it's important to note that we are in some ways handicapped by the fact that our Department of Homeland Security is partially shut down while we are in the middle of a war.
And Tolu, you've written extensively about the president's immigration operations over the last few months, especially, and his use of the National Guard in several cities around the United States. Can you, and others obviously feel free to jump in, talk about how the lines have now blurred between using National Guard troops on the streets of here in DC, we see them all the time, and elsewhere around the country, versus these larger scale military operations? Who's to distinguish between what is and isn't defending and keeping America safe when you have scenes like that around the country here?
Yeah, much of last year was the president talking about how the enemy within was the real danger. And he talked about using American cities as training grounds for American troops, and did deploy American troops into multiple cities, including Washington, D.C. And much of the last year was really about the president turning the power of the American military inward, focused on the homeland, focused on American cities and the American people, and also in his mind, protecting the homeland from what he views as dangerous illegal immigrants. And so this is a big shift as we go into 2026, where the president is using the American military much more in an outward-facing traditional manner, focused on other countries. Obviously, we saw the big operation in Venezuela. We have seen this operation that's ongoing in Iran.
And Venezuela, I just want to reinforce, that was a law enforcement operation, according to the administration, not a military, not a national security operation, let's say.
Yeah, and it shows how much these lines are being blurred in the second Trump administration, where what is law enforcement, what is military, what is domestic, what is foreign, it's becoming more and more of a blurry situation where the president sees it all as opportunities to extend his executive power, both on domestic audiences, but also, as he told our colleagues, in his role as he sees himself as president of the world.
I mean, both to Tom and Nancy, I'd love you to talk a little bit about, we've talked now, Tolu just described the National Guard being deployed on American streets. We had the Venezuela operation and enormous assets deployed to the Caribbean earlier this year, and then they were a number of them were moved to the Middle East. And now, as I've written this week, the president is even mulling operations in Cuba to try to remove yet another regime that he sees problematic. Is the military stretched too thin? Are they able to keep up with these demands and in such short time?
Well, I'll give you a description of sort of the strain. The USS Gerald Ford carrier strike group deployed last June. Its original mission was to go to Europe to really be America's face of its support of Ukraine. It then got diverted to the Caribbean for operations in Venezuela. It's now in the Middle East. It is extended multiple times and will nearly double, it looks like, its deployment time. There's also strains, and by the way, to conduct this mission in the Middle East, the U.S. has pulled resources, munitions from areas like the Western Hemisphere and the Asia Pacific, the two areas that the president said just a month ago were going to be the key focus of his national defense strategy. So I think a military that's sort of pulled into multiple missions, obviously it creates a strain. Yes, they are trained for it. Yes, they can do it, but it doesn't come without cost. Let's stick with the Ford. When you extend a unit, it not only affects personnel, divorce rates, stress on the family, but also the ship itself is not designed to go that long on these kinds of deployments. So there's sort of the practical realities, and then there's the munition shortages that we're seeing. One of the things that the U.S. is using at a really high tempo in this war with Iran is air defenses, because the Iranians are shooting ballistic missiles towards the U.S. and its allies. And so often we're spending millions of dollars for each ordinance we're launching to protect against those ballistic missiles. You'll remember last year, the United States said it couldn't provide those to Ukraine because we had shortages of them. And now we're using them at an incredibly high tempo. So there are all these strains that happen when you're going after multiple conflicts. It affects planning, it affects individual families, it affects the equipment and the ships we have and the planes we have, and then it also affects our munition stockpiles. And there hasn't been a public discourse about whether this is the kind of pace and tempo we want to go at. Is this the best use of these limited resources?
And okay, Tom, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just very quickly. It also, Nancy mentioned planning. It creates a dilemma for defense planners because they have to ask, what are we supposed to be doing? During the Cold War, we debated various strategies. Win. Sometimes what's called win, hold, win. Right? That you would win in Europe, you'd kind of hold in some other theater, and maybe win in another theater, perhaps, against the Koreans or something. And you could plan for that. This is just stray voltage in every direction, and that not just wears people down, wears down equipment, depletes munitions. But to replace all that stuff and to move on, planners have to know where are we supposed to be? And a lot of folks didn't see it, but it was interesting watching Undersecretary of Defense or War or whatever they want to call themselves, but the Undersecretary Bridge Colby, who was a big advocate of forget all this stuff, pivot to China, now having to answer questions about this and kind of squirming and not being able to really answer it. If the Undersecretary for Policy doesn't know what we're supposed to be doing, how's anybody else supposed to know?
That's a really interesting point. And I do want to kind of zoom out in the time we have left before I start taking audience questions. Tom, just to stick with you, I don't think that Republicans or Democrats are crying too much over the death of Ayatollah Khamenei. I don't think a lot of Democrats were too upset that Maduro was arrested and removed from power. And certainly, in Cuba, if the post-Castro regime were to be upended, even Democrats would probably privately celebrate that. But still, this country has a very complicated history of regime change. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, among the people not shedding tears would be me. But the idea that this reminds me of a caution that the late Charles Krauthammer once issued in the mid-90s, when the Americans really were, at the peak of their power, and the Russians weren't really a factor, and we were deciding to knock off bad guys. And Krauthammer warned, and I think presciently, about turning our foreign policy into a generic anti-son of a bitch policy. And, that, which is not to say that there aren't people who deserve it, but you can't simply do all of these things. And especially if you're not going to focus your attention, and I think the president has a very short attention span for these things, on what comes next, because all you may be doing, even though people are cheering the death of the Ayatollah, I guess the new guy is his son. And you may be laying up future troubles without thinking about how to actually stabilize the situation. And I'm part of the reason I'm as somebody who supported the first Gulf War and then was appalled at the way it was handled after we dislodged the regime. I think we're making the same mistake. We're saying, we can knock off a regime. Yes, American air power can degrade and really destabilize a regime. We saw that in Libya. We've seen it in other places. But if you're not thinking about what comes next, you're just borrowing trouble. I mean, there has to be something about the post-war resolution. Going into Venezuela and capturing Maduro was really almost like a TV show, because what's changed in Venezuela? What was the next move in Venezuela? Was it just to get Maduro and to be able to parade him around and say, thump our chests and say, look what we can do? Or did we actually want to do something to make Venezuela a better place and to stabilize that region? And I don't think, and once again, I don't think this administration is providing any answers beyond look what we can do.
Right. That's a really you've pulled out some interesting quotes there. So definitely food for thought. Totally. I just want to end with you because before we take audience questions, because given everything that you talked about in the president's sort of fixation on foreign policy for the sake of legacy, it makes me wonder, can foreign policy issues win elections? President Trump talks about how he has accomplished multiple peace deals. He brags about it all the time. Some of them are, factually questionable, but we won't get into that right now. But at the end of the day, he's not on the ticket in 2028, but JD Vance or Marco Rubio or someone will be. Is this helping their case, or do the American people not care?
There's little evidence that foreign policy ranks high on the minds of the American voter when it comes to their priorities for what they want as they go to vote in these midterm elections. In the past, maybe there have been rally around the flag moments, especially after the United States had been attacked. But that is not what we're experiencing right now. Instead, we are experiencing an electorate that is laser focused and cares a lot about their domestic issues. They care a lot about their family and what impacts them directly. And so the likelihood of foreign policy being a drag on a president as opposed to being something that gets them more support, it seems to be much more likely. It seems like people do not like endless foreign wars. They do not like foreign entanglements. They do not like American treasure being spent abroad without a lot of understanding as to how it's going to help them when they are dealing with their own financial issues. And so it doesn't appear that this is, at this moment, something that's likely to get a lot of support in the electorate. It has much more of a potential to be a drag on the president or to be something that people just are confused by and want the focus to be shifted back to domestic issues.
And potentially adding to that complication is the fact that the vice president, who could presumably be his successor, has been notoriously isolationist in his rhetoric.
That's right. And he has not been very outspoken about supporting this war in terms of when you look at who is the public face of all of this. He has talked in the past about how the U.S. should not be involved in these Middle Eastern wars. They should not be involved in trying to do regime change in Iran and elsewhere. And so I'm not surprised that we haven't heard very much from him over the past several days, because this is very much in line with the kind of thinking that he rallied against as he was seeking political office. And it seems to be very much out of step with his isolationist approach to governing.
We're going to have to put a pin in that one because that's going to be a really interesting
historical
one to watch.
Note, Vivian.
Oh,
just
please
one
do,
quick
Tom.
historical
Please do.
The lack of a rally around the flag effect is really notable. That's never happened. American presidents always get a bump from using military force. And it's really been surprising that Trump has not only not gotten a bump, but actually it seems to be hurting him, which is, having been through plenty of these, stories in the past is real. I mean, I remember the first Gulf War when Bush 41 was at 91% approval. That's remarkable that Trump is not getting any bump. And I think it's because people have decided what they think about Donald Trump. And the only people left to persuade are people who don't want to do this kind of stuff, independents who are not really in favor of this. And so that number is declining. But
it reminds me,
phenomenon.
Yeah, it reminds me of an old 1990s movie with John Candy called Canadian Bacon, where the American president was doing so poorly in the polls, and so his advisors suggested launching a war, and so they declared war on Canada, and to give him a bump. So that it kind of speaks to what you're talking about. Okay, let's take some audience questions. We got Cece from Wisconsin. Maybe Tolu or Tom might be able to answer this one, or Nancy. Can President Trump be impeached for starting a war without congressional approval?
I can take that. It's definitely possible, but I would say it's a very highly unlikely, in part because we haven't heard a lot of Republican lawmakers speaking out against this. Now, technically, the president is required to get authorization to go to war, to launch war, to declare war from Congress. He has not done that. There's some questions about sort of what authority belongs to the executive branch, what authority belongs to the legislative branch when it comes to war, when it comes to facing potential imminent threats. But I have not seen anything that would indicate that Republicans who are in charge in Congress, which would be responsible for impeaching the president, are abandoning him or objecting to what he's doing in any public way. And so while there's a possibility that any president could face impeachment for potentially misusing foreign power or using American power on foreign lands, it doesn't appear that that's likely or even in the realm of possibility in this instance.
I'm going to do one more on, yeah,
Presidents can be impeached for anything. People always ask this question, can the president be impeached? Impeachment's a political process. It's not a legal, black letter law issue. And so, yeah, he can be impeached for anything Congress thinks is a violation. But it's highly, even if after the midterms, if the Democrats control the House, they can impeach him, but they're never going to get a conviction. So it's not really a relevant question.
Right. So Catherine in Illinois, we're going to stick with politics for one more. Catherine in Illinois asks, to what extent Republican senators have come out publicly about this military action in Iran initiated by Trump? Do we know which Republicans have specifically, and has anyone spoken out about it, or at least raised concern about him not coming to Congress? Any particular people?
I haven't seen much in terms of the Republicans in the Senate specifically raising concerns. We have seen some Republicans like Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham very much in favor of this, speaking out positively about this. I think more at this stage, more of what sticks out to me is the silence from certain Republicans, the lack of enthusiasm in terms of supporting this. That may be a sign. People like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who in the past have broken from the president, have been willing to speak out against the president. We also have some military veterans like Joni Ernst in the Senate who may be asking questions behind the scenes. I will say that this administration has put more emphasis on briefing Congress this time around compared to their military action against Venezuela earlier this year, or even the Midnight Hammer strikes that they did in Iran last summer. And so that may be one of the reasons we're not hearing as much public questioning from the Senate. Maybe they're getting a little bit more in their briefings than they did before.
And there's definitely been Republicans in the House who have raised concerns, at least the concern that the president didn't go through Congress to launch these operations. So Nancy, Mary from Sag Harbor wants to know about what can be accomplished without boots on the ground. Particularly, can regime change happen without boots on the ground? What do you think?
I think, well, Mary asks a great question. So there is a U.S. military plan. The military plan sort of has 4 goals: targeting leadership, going after its Navy, the Iranian Navy, going after the ballistic missile capability and its nuclear facilities. That can weaken the Iranian defenses tremendously, such that they don't control their airspace and their governance is in jeopardy. What it can't do is set up the framework such that this regime, which has held power for many, many decades, to be overthrown, nor can it lead by itself for the Iranian civilians, many of them who've lived under this repressive regime, to create the framework for governance. And so I'll remind you that these are people who, if there were opposition, were tortured, exiled, imprisoned. And so it's very, the people you'd want to do this, the regime itself has taken it out of place. If I was looking for a scenario in which you could tie those military strikes to regime change, it would be that they lead to a mass number of defections within the Iranian defenses, such that they are willing to work with some element of civilians on the ground, abandon the regime, and help build a new kind of governance within Iran. So far, we haven't seen that, but we are in day 4, and I think you're going to see continued strikes on the Iranian defenses. That's the most realistic pathway that I can see to that.
Tom, I see you nodding. Any thoughts?
No, I'm nodding. I'm in heated agreement with Nancy. There have to be boots on the ground, but they don't have to be our boots. But there have to be somebody's boots on the ground. People are saying, some Trump supporters saying, well, regime change. You can do regime change with air power in like we did in Serbia. Well, not really. There was an army on the ground. It wasn't ours. But it was somebody's army. We did regime change in Libya by stripping the regime of its defenses and its security forces from the air. But then there were actual armed detachments of Libyans on the ground. So, the problem Nancy's pointing to is that the regime, this functionally totalitarian regime in Iran, was very efficient at making sure none of those kinds of detachments or organizations exist. So do there need to be boots on the ground for regime change? Yes. Do they need to be American boots? No, but somebody wearing boots has to be involved in creating and forcibly implanting a new regime. And right now that doesn't exist in Iran.
Well, also, like, the president struggled even to get a coalition to support his military action. Nancy and I wrote a story a few weeks ago. It wasn't a few weeks ago, Nancy. I don't even remember. Everything's a blur. About efforts to get Gulf countries even to offer support, logistical support, allow the bases in their countries to be used. And they wanted no part in it. You go to operations, the Israeli operations in Gaza, but also the Trump administration's efforts to secure a ceasefire and get, kind of establish security in Gaza. They've really struggled to assemble a force of sort of the willing in the region to go into Gaza and do this. And so, what does that tell you when he's struggling to build these coalitions to support his military adventurism, or this, in the case of Gaza, sort of the post-war efforts, both have sort of fallen flat for the time.
Well, what they tell me is that it almost mirrors what's happening domestically, where he hasn't brought in the buy-in. Now, I'll go back up with the Gulf partners. Their concern was that if they were let the United States use bases in their countries or showed support, that they would face retaliatory strikes from Iran. As it turns out, they're facing that anyway, to create that very pressure that they hope, the Iranians hope, will lead the Trump administration to take a different path or limit its strike campaign. Without that alliance, both domestically and internationally, this really becomes Trump's war. It's not America's. It's not something in which it has the backing of the American public behind it, or an alliance behind it, or a shared vision. And so he has, as Tom pointed out, the night of the strikes, this is a gamble that he has chosen to take. And it's the key part of that gamble is the decision to not bring in interested key parties who could be vital to shaping not only the war, but the post-war period.
Right. Oh my God, that's very interesting. And so Howard from Maryland asks an important question. The Trump administration has fired many of the most experienced generals and admirals as well as many senior analysts, intel officials, and defense and national security administrators. And top positions are filled with people chosen for their loyalty rather than their experience or knowledge. As the war drags on, will that lack of experience in vital positions put the success of our mission at risk?
I'd love to hear Tom's thought on this too. So there have been more than 24 admirals and generals pushed out in the run-up to this. And I can tell you, depending on what it's created, is a climate of people feeling that they can't sort of speak up and raise concerns, saying something as simple as, I'm not sure this is going to work, or here are some things to think about. And not only that, the people who are coming after them often are coming from they wouldn't be in that position normally. They're going 2 or 3 rungs down to fill those positions. And so I think the way you're seeing this manifest, not only at the Pentagon, by the way, but we saw reports from NBC News earlier this week that Kash Patel had fired agents who specialize in Iranian counterintelligence, is that there's not the environment to sort of raise concerns. I actually think we've already seen it practically span out as well. Many of the embassies in the Middle East are not filled with ambassadors. We saw the State Department through its embassies across the region urging Americans to leave while the airports were closed. And so it's those lack of details that aren't being sort of thought about or discussed, because I don't think people feel like they can raise them. And so we're seeing the lack of precision manifest in real time in this conflict. They're seeing the military now scramble and the State Department scramble to get American citizens out, whereas the British, who did not know that this attack was going to come the way it did, were able to get military flights out to get their citizens out. So that's what's lost. I don't know if it fundamentally changes how the military operates, but these battles are won and lost on those kinds of details. And that's what's lost when you lose the expertise, but also the ability to raise real concerns without fearing the loss of your own job.
Really important. We only have about a minute left, and so I'm going to do a little roundtable with you all, starting with you, Tolu. Just 30 seconds. Tell us what's on your mind with regard to this story. What are you looking to chase and write about next?
I'm really interested in where the MAGA coalition goes next. They have given Trump a short leash in terms of how long they're going to let this last. So I will be watching to see whether or not that leash is starting to expire, whether we hear more right-wing figures dismiss this military adventurism as, a version of neocon politics that they don't want to be a part of. If we see that, that could be really detrimental for President Trump.
Tom?
My concern is one that I used to warn when I was a professor at the Naval War College, that, right now we're seeing a lot of operational success because the U.S. military operationally is the most capable military in the world. They're the best. The problem is that without strategic guidance or vision, operational successes don't start mounting up into a strategic success. And I'm looking ahead to say, when at some point, especially if something goes wrong, as in every one of these operations, something will go wrong. What strategic vision is going to guide what we do next? And I think Nancy, I just want to really emphasize Nancy's point that what we're losing is not expertise, although that's a problem, but that the willingness of military and intelligence professionals to speak up and say, hey, I'm concerned about, these things that are about to happen, because I don't think that they feel they can do that right now. So I feel like I'm in the something bad is about to happen tension, and then wondering how we actually move forward after that.
And Nancy?
In addition to the points that Tolu and Tom raised, I'm watching for the intersection between this war and domestic politics, specifically on the economy. We've seen an effect on the stock market's drops there, rises in oil and gas, and I'm looking for at what point those economic and domestic pressures reshape how we think about operating on the battlefield.
These are really important stories, and I can't wait to read them. Thank you to the three of you again for helping us make sense of all of this, and obviously for your hard work and everyone's at the Atlantic. And thank you all for joining us. If you are interested in subscribing to the Atlantic and you have not done so, please log on to theatlantic.com/subscribe for more details. And obviously to those of you who are subscribers, we appreciate it, and you can get more of our national security coverage, our politics coverage, and everything else about the Trump administration's operations at theatlantic.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day or evening wherever you are.
Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you.
Thanks.